$25 million for 1 year in Chicago. That's kind of a lot of money to play basketball.
You think?
But I guess, just like anything else, the business can pay it. And, that's, I guess, what the value is. And you can't blame people for wanting to get the value for what they can do, because most of us can't. But I guess the point is that the problems don't go away just because you throw $25 or $50 million at somebody.
Now, look at how many teams have tried to buy the pennant, the Red Sox for so many years, and the Rangers. The Florida Panthers are in that situation now. They've put a lot of money into this free agency. They've had a good draft, have a good coach. They expect to win the pennant, the Stanley Cup, and they may very well, and they may not.
Well, the Florida Marlins won a couple of them back in the day when fire sales were more common. So, Frank, can you talk about the types of pressures the players and the coaches face during the course of the season?
Well, when you work in a sport or in an area where your progress is on a jumbotron, where everybody can see what's going on and whether you're succeeding or failing, you're under a lot of pressure. And the first thing I used to do when I got to a stadium, if the game had started, was to look up the scoreboard to see whether we were doing well or not. And your performance is constantly under a microscope, particularly with media coverage now.
Oh, yeah.
Interestingly, and you guys probably know more about this than I do, but in the earlier days, the reporters and the players were making about the same amount of money. They played cards together, they ate together, they did all, and they were protective of one another. When players' salaries started to skyrocket, they left the reporters far behind, and all of a sudden the players' behavior became a sport. It became a legitimate thing to criticize, and the whole picture has changed. I think players get too much exposure. I think they should have privacy as to what their injury is, and the world shouldn't know what their injury is. And I think there are a number of things we can do to improve sports. One is that the teams could lower the price of the tickets so that they haven't put the middle class out of any participation in watching sports. At a hockey game, the tickets in the bowl right off the ice can be as much as $200 or $300 a game per person.
No question.
You know, a family of four, that's a big bite out of your income.
Better hope you win them, because it would be, you'd have to put a second mortgage on your house to pay for that.
Well, let me tell you, if I weren't a member of the media, I would not be paying these ticket prices, that's for sure. So, Frank, no matter how much these guys are paid, the drive is still stressful, isn't it?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
That's all right. No matter how much these athletes are paid, the drive is still stressful, isn't it, for these guys?
Oh, yeah. It's a very high stress. And you forget that people talk about the advantage of playing at home. But the disadvantage of playing at home is that you're leaving your family, your kid might be sick, and you don't want to leave to go to play, or you've had an argument with your wife, or you couldn't in the past make your payments on your mortgage. Everything is stressful. They have the same kind of stresses as you and I,
right.
Plus the fact that everything they do is in the public domain.
Right.
Frank, you mentioned something there. They have the same family stresses that you and I would have. Would the players come to you and you would privately counsel them like they were going to like a mental health counselor's office anywhere?
Some of that.
So there was some of that?
I tried to keep that at a minimum. I would say I don't prefer to do shrink stuff with you. I prefer to get a private practitioner. But if you want, let's talk about it. We can make a referral. What were some of your tactics to get through to some of these athletes that, obviously they didn't get where they are without feeling that they were the best, having a little bit of an ego? How do you break things down with them so that they'll actually trust you and, confide in you? players, and that doesn't happen when you're starting out. But over the years, when you can go into a room and say, X player X from another team is a good friend of mine, and they call that player X, and all of a sudden you're in. It's as simple as that. But when you're starting out, you don't have that springboard. You have to kind of prove. There's a lot of suspicion because management pays you, and the players think that you're immediately reporting everything to management, and that really isn't the case.
Well, that's a good percent.
I'm sure it's happened, but it's not the practice that it ought to be.
Yeah, and you know what? That's a good point too, Frank, because a lot of times when players have injuries and they deal with team doctors versus a private physician, then one's hired by the team versus getting the second opinion. So I can totally relate. Let's go back on Jeff's point just a moment, Frank. Obviously, superstar athletes are a different breed, and I know that there's some ego in the way when you initially deal with some of them. But how do you actually break through with these guys, and how do you make them comfortable enough to speak with you with some of the most intimate thoughts and fears? Because that takes a heck of a lot of work to try to break that barrier.
I think you have to hang around a lot. They have to be used to seeing you and have to be comfortable with you. And that's not always easy to accomplish. Realistically, in sports, players who are real superstars in team sports are not going to be too interested in this.
Right. I can appreciate that.
Conversely, superstars in tennis and golf are very interested in this.
Right. Anything where there's an awful lot of thinking involved, the more thinking involved, the more interest, because there's a lot of the little knickknacks that go on besides what your performance on the field or playing surface or whatnot. So,
yeah.
So,
and I don't think fans understand the game as well as they talk it. For example, if a field goal kicker misses a field goal, immediately they're on his case. They don't realize that a field goal consists of the offensive line being disciplined, a perfect snap from the long snapper, perfect placement from the holder, and then a perfect execution of the kick. Anything that goes wrong there, the kick's not going to go through the uprights.
That's not necessarily just the kicker.
Right. Look at how that missed field goal in the Super Bowl cost Scott Norwood his career in Buffalo.
Right, I remember that.
Football.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I rarely predict or try to predict sports, but that night I said to my wife, he's going to miss it, because the reporters were all saying, all the commentators were saying, he has never kicked a field goal that long. And I said, everybody on the sidelines is going to be telling him, you can do it, you can do it. No one is going to remind him that it still has to go through the uprights.
Well, unfortunately, Donnie Moore lost his life with the Angels many years ago, so I understand the mindset there. So, Frank, tell me, do coaches seek you out? I imagine that they would.
Some do. Like, if they get to know you and you're somebody else that say you're okay, they do. If they don't know you, they're suspicious of you until you can kind of break through. And it's not always easy to break through. Sometimes you just can't. They treat you well, they're friendly to you, but they don't have any respect for what you do.
And what did you enjoy the most about working with professional teams?
Winning.
Winning. Boy, that's...
And seeing players perform better.
Seeing player. And you indicated that you're a sports fan yourself?
Yeah, I'm less of a fan than I used to be, because once you see an industry from the inside, you lose a lot of respect for it.
Oh yeah, especially this day and age too. Yeah.
And there are a lot of backroom dealings and a lot of shenanigans that go on in sports that are possibly even unethical, but they certainly violate the rules. Look at how many colleges violate the rules of the NCAA and not even prosecuted for it.
Well, you would know how the sausage is made more than most, as they say. Well, Frank, let me ask you this. I'm sure there are a few moments during your career where you know that something that you did really, made a difference in a team or made a difference in a player's performance or their life. Is there one or two examples that stand out from your career that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, I was with the Calgary Stampeders in the Canadian Football League, and we happened to come east, and we had back-to-back games in the east, so we stayed east for a week. And I worked with the teams every day between the two games, and the performance of the players became noticeably better. The coaches commented on it, and coaches said to me that was a turning point of their season, and we won the Grey Cup that year. I don't want to take credit for it, but that might have been one of the things that contributed to the Grey Cup win.
Okay, I got two more questions, Frank. As you look back on your career, what are you most proud of? Loaded question, Frank?
Yeah, that's a very hard question.
How about not the most, but something you're proud of?
Well, I don't know.
I'm sure you're proud of a lot of things.
Well, gotta be.
I tell you, I feel as though I'm one of the luckiest people in the world, career-wise, because I had fantasies of living in the East and consulting on the West Coast, and that happened to me several times. And I worked with the Italian Olympic team, the Lillehammer Olympics.
Right.
So I just feel lucky. And I'm lucky that I had the opportunity. I'm lucky that most of them worked out well.
And another thing, for someone wanting to get into sports psychology, Frank Lodato, a high school or college kid, or even a professional mental health counselor listening to this interview, what would you recommend?
Do something else.
Do something else.
That's what I tell people about being a lawyer sometimes. It sounds like it's a universal thing. Whatever you are, don't do it.
Well, no, because there are so many programs now. Most of the people who graduate with a master's degree will probably never get a job.
Right.
Most of the people with a PhD will probably never get a full-time job. The best they can do is some consultancy. It's not the path to riches for most people. A couple of people will hit it really well, but for the most time, it's struggle going from team to team, trying to hold on. A lot of politics in Olympic sports. It's a very, very difficult grind. I think it's rewarding and it's fun, but it's very difficult to find a job at this point.
All right. Well, Frank, we want to thank you for being here on the South Florida Tribune podcast. We really appreciate your wisdom, your knowledge, and without a doubt, we look forward to bringing you on again at a later date, and look forward to some of the other hockey people that will be coming on the program down the line. Frank, anything you want to add to it, Jeff?
Frank, it's absolutely been a pleasure. I've learned a lot and can't thank you enough for your time.
Well, thank you guys for having me, and I look forward to being with you again.
All right, we do too. So with that said, we're going to go on to a few other notes, newsworthy things, right, Jeff?
Sure. I think that right out of the gate, how can we not talk about the Florida Panthers?
Without a doubt. And since we're going to talk about the Florida Panthers, you know what? First of all, I want to show my support for retired goaltender Roberto Luongo. Retires with 489 wins. His number one will be retired, and he's a future Hall of Famer, a.k.a. Terry Sawchuk, Detroit Red Wings. Number one's going up in the rafters. No better person to be up in the rafters than Roberto Luongo. Some thoughts about the career of Roberto Luongo?
Well, I think you're right. I think he will be the first player, his number retired by the Panthers. And if you think about it, how unselfish of him. He had several years left on that albatross of a contract.
Right.
And for him to retire, that allowed them to sign Sergei Bobrovsky, and we'll talk about that.
Right.
But, I mean, talk about a guy who really loves the franchise, loves South Florida. I'm sure he's going to be around the community. I know he's got a home in Parkland. You can't really say enough about him. He's more than just